Hello, I'm Dennis Tucker. I appreciate you tuning into this program. I hope you'll spend the time to study with me. As you may or may not be aware of, it depends if you watch this on a regular basis or not, but I have changed locations. At this time, I'm actually upstairs. My wife kicked me out from downstairs. She's doing some things down there. It's too cold outside, wintry, snow actually outside. And so I decided to come up here and actually do this lesson. And I hope that you again will profit from this. We want to study about one of the major characters of the Bible. That is Moses. And again, he's truly one of the great characters of all the Bible, and especially the Old Testament. He's a central character in the book of Exodus as far as telling the story of the history of children of Israel, how they had gone from the last chapter of Genesis of moving into the land of Egypt until the last chapter of Exodus, where they have left Egypt and are out in the wilderness, and they have become really a distinct nation by this time. And so we look at Exodus. It says a lot about Moses, and we see his name mentioned in Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, all of those things together. We want to look at the early part of Moses' life in this lesson right here. And perhaps a little bit later on, we'll study more about Moses as the great leader and Moses as the lawgiver. But that's not really our purpose in this lesson. And the first thing we want to look at is Moses and his humble beginnings. And humble there may not be exactly the right word to use, because it was very turbulent times in Egypt for the children of Israel. And as you look into Exodus 2nd chapter, verse 1, it said, "A man in the house of Levi went and took as a wife a daughter of Levi. So a woman conceived and bore a son, and she saw that he was a beautiful child, and she hid him 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, dabbed it with asphalt and pitch, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. And his sister stood afar off to know what would be done to him. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and her maidens walked along the riverside. And when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. And when she had opened it, she saw the child. And behold, the baby wept. So she had compassion on him and said, 'This is one of the Hebrews' children.' And then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, 'Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you?' And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Go.' So the maiden went and called the child's mother. And then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages.' So the woman took the child and nursed him. And the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and became her son. So she called his name Moses, saying, 'Because I drew him out of the water.'" There's a number of facts that are given in this passage, but also in especially in the book of Acts, 7th chapter, that helps to fill in some of the gaps. There are things we may, we know about Moses and this part of his life, of the birth all the way to becoming part of Pharaoh's household, that we put together because of what other passages say in the Bible about this event here. And one is that Exodus 2nd chapter does not actually give us the name of his parents. It simply says a man from the house of Levi, and he marries a daughter of the house of Levi. So they're both Levites, but their names are given actually in Exodus 6th chapter, verse 20. And there said, "Now Aram took for himself Jochebed, his father's sister, as wife, and she bore him Aaron and Moses. And the years of Amram were 137. And so we have here a father and mother's name actually given. And it's one of the situations where you start reading through this, he actually marries, it says, his father's sister. And a lot of these families were really big families, and they had children that, ranged a lot of years in age. And also they had multiple wives talked about in the Old Testament. And so here we had him marrying, obviously, it gives a lot of information, but that's somebody, whether it's half sister or not, we don't know, it doesn't really specify in our passage here, but we do know the name of both his parents, Aram and Jochebed. And also we look and we find that actually it talks about his brother and also his sister, and that is that we have here Aaron talked about as far as a brother of his. And also we find that the sister's name was Miriam. And so we look here, and again, both are very prominent in the book of Exodus, and later on mentioned as far as, and some in the good light, some in the bad light, as far as both those siblings. But also we looked at, he was born into a hostile environment. And that is, okay, he's born into an environment where in Exodus first chapter, it explains to us that there was indeed, after Joseph brought his family from Canaan into Egypt, and after they settled on land of Goshen, that everything's good when you end Genesis, the 50th chapter. But when you pick up here in Exodus, the first chapter, you find that after many years later on, about 400 years later on roughly, that we have a Pharaoh who did not know what Joseph had done for Egypt. And we also find that by this time they have become slaves. And not only that, but also there's a fear among the Egyptians that these Hebrews are multiplying so much that they're going to outnumber us, that they are going to be so mighty and so powerful they can actually supplant our authority here or take over our government. And therefore, there was a desire to actually kill them off, or to at least stop them from multiplying so much. So there, eventually, Pharaoh told the midwives that the male children, you're to kill them. Now, again, you think about hostile environments. There are times, as far as parents, as we have our children look at the things that are going on now, and we often fret over the fact of what kind of world our children will grow up in. And we see things happening. My parents grew up in a time of the Great Depression. And, I grew up in a time of the Soviet Union, the Cold War. And we look today, we may have the same fretting as far as what's going to be for our country, for our children. But I don't think any of us have actually seen the hostile environment that the children of Israel faced right here, talked about. And that is that, and that talks about in Acts 17, verse 18, which is, again, a different account, but kind of fills and gas for us there. It said, till another king arose who did not know Joseph. And then verse 19 said, this man dealt treacherously with our people and oppressed our forefathers, making them expose their babies so they may not live. And then also another fact about Moses, humble beginnings of a Levite, Hebrew, the desire to kill off the babies, and Moses in danger of that. But also, even if he lived, what kind of life was he going to have? I'm speaking of this in a purely human point of view. I know we are told things in the Bible that fills in the gas for us so we understand the big picture about Moses, but put yourself in the position of Abraham and Jochebed, and you have a child, just as all the other Hebrews that had children, they look at their children by this time, and what's the child going to be? He's going to be a slave, or she's going to be a slave in Egypt. They're not going to be doctors and lawyers. They're not going to be steady businessmen. They are going to be slaves working for the king of Egypt. And so you look at that point of view. And not only that, but it says that his mother hid him for 3 months. Okay, there's the desire to kill off these male children. She has a male child. What's she going to do? She decides to hide the child. Acts 7, verse 20. It says, this time Moses was born and was well pleasing to God. Keep that kind of underline that for a later point here and all that. So, well pleasing to God, and he was brought up in his father's house for 3 months. Now again, for 3 months she is hiding this child because she knows that the decree was from Pharaoh to kill the male children. And at that point, at the 3 months, so you have to think about how can you have a child for 3 months? Well, obviously she's doing this from the Egyptians. But eventually children grow. And eventually it's going to become too much. So what she does then is that she takes him and puts him in a basket on the Nile River. On the Nile River, we read on the river there. The Nile River was a river with crocodiles. It was, again, a dangerous position. She was literally putting this child, in harm's way by putting him on the Nile River in this basket. What would happen to the child? What's the likelihood that this child would either be eaten up by a crocodile or would be exposed to the elements, eventually die if nothing else happened? Or what about if the basket start taking on water and the child would just drown? Or what if the child had rocked a little bit and had tipped over into the water? I mean, there's a lot of what ifs in this situation, right? However, as we look at it, we then see, as I read before, that the daughter of Pharaoh, Exodus 2 verse 5, the daughter of Pharaoh sees this child. And again, notice here that this child was very beautiful. Sees this child, and she has compassion on him. She spares his life. That the daughter of Pharaoh transgresses her own father's desire, wishes. And I realize at this time that probably she was not going to be endangered by breaking Pharaoh's law. She may have been, may not have been. We don't know that for sure, but she would have not been like one Hebrew women having a child who, if she'd been caught with this child, maybe actually been killed herself. In this case here, she's the daughter of Pharaoh. She transgresses her own father's law. She has compassion on the child. And then we have here Miriam, Moses' sister, older sister obviously, sees what's happening and comes forward. And that is basically volunteering to find a Hebrew woman so as to nurse this child. And therefore Jochebed, because she takes this child, Mary goes back to her mom, and Jochebed then, his mother, actually is paid to nurse Moses. And Moses, as we end here, talked about that goes into Pharaoh's household and becomes one like Pharaoh's daughter, or like his son of Pharaoh's daughter, and he's treated as one of the people of the household. Now, you start thinking about that, and I think there's some important points to make about this. One is that the phrase there, Moses was a beautiful child. I don't think we need to minimize that. And honestly, when we look at children as they're born, and you look at that child, that many children, as you look at them, think they're precious and they're beautiful, and that's what Moses was. Perhaps there was something extraordinary about his look. Even as a child, as a young child, that they look at and think, that's probably one of the most pretty, beautiful children I've ever seen. He's a beautiful child. And that actually is part of what gets Pharaoh's daughter to pay attention. But Moses' parents were then made the choice. Moses' parents made the choice to disobey Pharaoh. That's the second point here. One is a beautiful child. Second is that his parents had a choice here, and they chose to disobey Pharaoh and hide their son. Now, they did what many parents would do, so as to spare their child, or trying to give their child a chance to live. But also in this whole account, we see God's divine providence. In fact, there's a lot of accounts like this in the Bible, where when we watch a movie and we see things, how they work out, we say, well, that just worked out too well. That just worked out too good. I mean, what's chances of all that happening? Well, that's the situation here. That you look and you start reading through this, say, okay, what's the chances of all this happening exactly like this? Of his mom and being able to hide him for 3 months, of the midwives actually sparing the children, the male children, being able to hide him for 3 months, put him in a basket on Nile River and nothing happens to him. Pharaoh's daughter meets him, sees the child and has compassion on him, that his own mother gets to nurse him. What's the chance of that happening? Well, I think we need to understand God's divine providence in this. And what that means, divine providence, is God's hand working in his providential way to make his will come about. You read this here, and there's not necessarily a miracle talked about. We sometimes downplay that word, what it means, and redefine miracle. It's not just an extraordinary event. It's not just something that rarely occurs. A miracle literally is something that violates the very laws of nature. There's nothing really, as we read through this here, violate the laws of nature, but yet I think we have to understand God was working in this. This was not just by accident. God's divine providence is at work. And not only that, but also the fourth fact here. First one, a beautiful child. The second one, his parents deciding to disobey Pharaoh, which spared his life. The third one was God's divine providence. But the fourth one is a statement made over in Acts 20, verse 7 about this. It said, this time Moses was born and was well pleasing to God, and he was brought up in his father's house for 3 months. That one point there, to me, is interesting because later on we see Moses as the servant, Moses as the lawgiver, Moses as the leader of children of Israel. Here, though, we see Moses as the baby who hadn't done any of these things yet. But yet it says he was well-pleasing to God. There are a few other individuals in the Bible that we think about. Jeremiah, that God taught to Jeremiah, said, I formed you in the womb. And there's the indication in Jeremiah, first chapter, that God knew the character of Jeremiah, even before he was born. Then we talk about the Apostle Paul, of God choosing him, separating him to be a servant to God. There are times we have to understand God knows our hearts, knows the kind of person we are. And so here we have, he was well pleased with Moses as a young baby. Then as we go on here in Exodus, we find in Exodus 2nd chapter. Now, Exodus, I read Exodus 2, verse 1 through 10. Well, Exodus 2, verse 11, there is obviously a time gap here. Verse 10 is part of Pharaoh's household. Verse 11, now we have him as the young man. And so verse 11 of Exodus 2nd chapter. As it now came to pass in those days, when Moses grown, they went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren, and said he looked this way and that way. When he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And went out on the second day, behold, 2 Hebrew men were fighting. He said to the one who did the wrong, why are you striking your companion? Then he said, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? So Moses feared and said, surely this thing is known. When Pharaoh heard this matter, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. And we'll stop right there. Again, Exodus 2, verses 11 through 15 tells us about this event. Well, Acts 7th chapter again gives us some more information. In verse 21, Acts 7, verse 21, it said, when he was set down, Pharaoh's daughter took him away and brought him up as her own son. And Moses learned all the wisdom of the Egyptians, was mighty in words and deeds. And when he was 40 years old, it came to his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. And seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended and avenged him who was oppressed and struck down the Egyptian. For he supposed that his brethren would have understood that God would deliver them by his hand, but they did not understand. And the next day he appeared to 2 of them as they were fighting, and tried to reconcile them, saying, men, you are brethren. Why do you wrong one another? But he did his neighbors wrong, pushed them away, and said, who made you a ruler and judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you did the Egyptian yesterday? Then this saying, Moses fled and became a dweller in the land of Midian, where he had 2 sons. So we get to combine these 2 accounts, and we notice here Moses as this young man, 40 years of age by this time, that he goes, that we see the boldness in his convictions. We see a bold Moses right here. And that is, first of all, he goes out to visit his brethren in Acts, the 7th chapter. Visit here, and honestly, when you look at Exodus, 2nd chapter, he goes out and looks at the burdens they are bearing. That visit just doesn't mean to stop by and say, how you doing? In the New Testament, visit means to relieve the affliction, means to take care of what needs to be taken care of. And so he goes out there and he sees the oppression of the Israelites by the Egyptian taskmaster, and he kills him. He kills the taskmaster. And then not only that, but also the next day, that when his brethren are fighting, he confronts them about, why are you struggling with each other? Why are you fighting one another? And this man, this Moses is a bold Moses. Bold enough to go out to see the children of Israel, bold enough to go out and kill slave masters, bold enough to go out and confront his own brethren in this matter. Now later on, if you go on, we're not going to read the passage, but later on you find that in the land of Midian, he actually is bold enough to protect Jethro's daughters, and one of those become his wife, Zipporah. But he's bold enough to protect the women in the land of Midian, of Jethro's daughters. And so Moses, when he saw things were not right, he was bold enough to speak out and do something about it. And again, that is boldness as you look at it. And we see the same boldness spoken of with the apostles later on. In Acts, the 4th chapter, verse 18, when they had been threatened, when they arrested them by the Jewish authority says, they called and commanded them not to speak at all, nor to teach the name of Jesus. But Peter and John answered, said to them, whether it's right in the sight of God to listen to you more than God, you judge. For he cannot but speak things we have seen and heard. And then it goes on and says, in verse 29, now, Lord, look on the threats and grant your servants that with all boldness they may speak your word. They weren't going to be intimidated. They weren't going to be afraid of the Jewish authorities of the population. And this boldness has a good asset to it in the sense of that we are to be bold with the word of God. We're to be bold in our service to God. And we are to, talk about when the Lord talks, says there's one Lord. That means there's one Savior. And there's one gospel. There's not many different gospels. There's one church established, not many different churches. The church that Jesus died for on the day of Pentecost. And we need to understand the need to say those things. And so we have here the boldness of Pharaoh. But also the strength of the boldness of Moses. But also we have the strength of Moses as a decision maker. In one way we look at this, say that they kind of gave him a little trouble. But Moses here, when he goes out to see his brethren, again, he's part of Pharaoh's household. And what does that mean? That means he would have been educated as a ruling part of the Pharaoh's household, of the upper echelon of the Egyptian society. It would have meant that he would have lived in whatever luxury Pharaoh's household had. It would have been part of his. He would have grown up with the best food and the best clothes and the best servants. And we've been taught how great he was by the Egyptians as far as a part of being Pharaoh's household. And at that point, though, Moses makes a conscious decision here to serve God. The Hebrew writer, Hebrews 11, verse 24, said, by faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction of the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than treasure in Egypt, for he looked the reward. And just kind of look at this here, just thinking about this, I think Hebrews 11, verse 24 is not referring to Moses at the burning bush, but Moses as the young man that he decides to side with the children of Israel. And so he made that choice to serve God, is what the Hebrew writer is saying to us. And many passages in the Bible instructs the children of God to choose him, to choose to serve God as Christians. Over in James 4th chapter, verse 4. That James, there's the adulterers and adulteresses. Do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Whoever therefore wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Now that word friendship there means to align yourself. And really what James is talking about, what James is warning against, is trying to align ourselves with the world and at the same time somehow think we're going to be friends of God. He said that's not going to happen. Jesus in Matthew 6, verse 24 said, no one can serve two masters, for either will hate the one and love the other, or else he'll be loyal to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. You got to choose who you're going to serve. Who's going to be your God? What are you going to do with your life in service to him? Now, some people will try to not make that choice. Some people will choose not to choose, and by default, they're really choosing not to serve God. King Agrippa in Acts, the 26th chapter, is a good example of that. When he said, for a convenient time, I'll call for you later on. Some simply make the decision, I'm going to follow God, but then don't follow through with it. They kind of make that initial decision. I'm going to do what God said, but then they don't actually do what God said to do. Moses, the person, he chose to serve God. Now again, he chose to kill this Egyptian, and I'll talk about that for a minute here, but he was trying to serve God. The third thing about Moses is that we see the bad part, and that is the zeal of Moses was the wrong kind of zeal. And there's a lot of things about it. I read this passage of Moses when he goes out and sees the Egyptian oppressing the Israelites, and he kills the Egyptian slave masters. You kind of think about what Paul mentioned over in Romans 10, verse 2, about his brethren. They had zeal, but not according to knowledge. And because of that, they sought to establish their own righteousness. They talks about here in Romans 10, verse 1 and 2. And there's a lot of people that have zeal, but without knowledge. And zeal, does not justify misguided action. And you kind of look at this here. Did this situation really call for Moses to kill the Egyptian slave master? Was that really what God wanted him to do? Kind of question there for everybody to think about. But only that, but also zeal without knowledge, in this case right here, impeded God's purposes with Moses. Again, I know somebody's going to hear me say that, and somebody's going to say, oh, wait here, God used Moses, and when Moses got in the wilderness, those 40 years land in Midian, he's training him to show how humble he needs to be and how much he needs God, and that God's purpose for Moses was not to liberate one Israelite, but the whole Israelite nation. I understand that, but from the point of view of Moses was in exile for 40 years, what would happen if Moses hadn't killed the Egyptian? What would have happened if simply had listened to God and sought God's counsel instead of killing this Egyptian? Again, we don't know for sure. But I can tell you this, that 40 years after the wilderness meant that Moses would have lost his position in the Egyptian society, in Egyptian government culture. He would have lost his influence as far as being part of the ruling class of the Egyptians. He almost lost his life. And so there was great effort involved with Moses, but was not according to the right purpose, or not according to God's will. God wanted Moses, again, I'll say this, Moses is going to bring out not just one person from oppression, but the whole nation of Israel. Therefore, the zeal was without knowledge. In Moses, we see the hardships of life and the trials and defeat, especially this first part here about how he was wrong and how he had to run off so to save his life. But we also see what can happen when somebody has the right kind of faith in God, when somebody's listening to God and then does what God says with Moses as we look on in his life later on. Again, another lesson there. But all of us have our trials, and all of us have our problems, and all of us have our defeats. But also, what we can overcome if we have faith. That we too can walk with God as Moses did if we simply believe and trust him and do what God says to do. There's a great lesson there for Moses as far as humble beginnings. Many of us have humble beginnings. Oppression, living in a wicked world. We live in a wicked world. But we can listen to God, do what he says to be pleasing to him. Again, another lesson about Moses in maybe a few weeks from now. But I appreciate you watching. If you can't come be with us, Lilac Road. Our building is located at 1687 Lilac Road, Litchfield, Kentucky. Sunday morning at 9:30 we have Bible classes. At 10:25 is worship. Sundays at 5 p.m. we have worship. And on Wednesday nights at 6 p.m. we have Bible classes. Appreciate you watching. Feel free to share this. Feel free to hit the like button and contact me if you have any questions, comments, or maybe a Bible subject you'd like to hear discussed at this time. I appreciate it. I hope you have a good day.